So this is Grand Theft Auto 6. Sometimes I wonder, why did Rockstar choose Miami of all locations for this game, when there are plenty of other US cities with even bigger populations. You know, sometimes I imagine, what if GTA 6 was set in Chicago and you could play as some Polish dude on the north side? Or what if it was set in Baltimore and you could play as a zombie? But then I had some time to think about it a little bit more, and I actually think they made the right decision, because Miami is actually a city filled with scammers, fraudsters, and boosters. There's so much crime in Miami that I've become disappointed in myself, and with the fact that I know the name of some random judge in the city, and I'm not even from Miami. But you might know her name too.
But the judge notices something familiar about this defendant.
Okay, Mr. Booth, I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you go to Nautilus for middle school?
Oh my goodness.
He was picked up at the cruise. What were you on, the Breeze?
Yes.
Yeah, me too. Isn't that cool? Or you had a nice cruise?
You was on a cruise this weekend that just passed?
Yeah.
Oh, you didn't see me dancing? I was the one
You were
dancing.
dancing. I was sitting upstairs in the shade.
Yes, but this
you
is
weren't
crazy.
in that contest by the pool now, were you? Nah, I didn't see you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were.
I definitely was.
All right.
And you know that contest by the pool was something stinky with people dancing on each other. Probably playing the song Wobble Baby by VIC. But aside from your everyday burglary and parking lot stabbing, there's actually a specific type of crime in the city where Miami really shines. According to Money.com, Miami is the worst city in the nation for identity theft. Scams like identity theft and other types of fraud are rampant in the city. And to me, life would be a total nightmare if stuff like this happened to me every day.
Tonight, a South Florida man is in jail accused of scamming the stars. Investigators say he duped or tried to dupe athletes, pop stars, and more.
According to the Miami Herald, Lee also served 2 years in prison for posing as a rep for pop star Madonna. He's also accused of posing as Oprah Winfrey's nephew, executives from her cable television network, and a former aide for President Barack Obama in attempts to get free stuff.
Dude, you were posing as Oprah's nephew? Come on, man. And in 2018, just north of Miami in Palm Beach, fake doctor Malachi Love Robinson was arrested for pretending to be a doctor at 18 years old.
The kid in the lab coat being taken away by cops isn't a doctor. He's just 18 years old.
They say you examined a patient today.
You will from my lawyer.
So how did Miami and South Florida in general become this bastion for fraudulent behavior? And what are the factors that led to this? Well, to understand that, we'll have to tell the history of the city of Miami. And the story of Miami starts with the deep freeze. In the winter of 1895, the northern and central parts of Florida experienced an unprecedented freeze. Orlando, for example, reached an all-time record low of 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's still the record today. And before all you dudes that live in South Dakota in the middle of nowhere start commenting saying, that's not cold, blah, 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 that wasn't the issue. The issue was that the low temperature freeze would kill much of Florida's citrus crops. Don't you feel bad? This came as awful news to the thousands of new settlers that had moved down to Florida in the years after the Civil War, many of whom hoped to strike it rich growing citrus fruits in the state. Julia Tuttle had been one of these recent transplants by way of Cleveland, Ohio, but she had never been as interested in growing fruit. What interested her more was the potential of the sparsely populated area along the Miami River. When her father died in 1890, she used the money from her parents' estate to buy a 640-acre plot of land on the north side of the river. This land purchase coincided with developer Henry Flagler's ambition to put a train line through Florida. Julia would often write letters begging Flagler to extend his train line down all the way to the Miami River, but she was often rebuffed. However, the Great Freeze changed everything. Out of all of Florida's regions, the Miami River was one of the few areas where the citrus crops didn't die. The area's tropical climate protected it from the worst of nature, and Julia saw that as the area's hook. Julia alerted Flagler that the freeze had spared the Miami River, sending as evidence a bouquet of flowers and some oranges to Flagler, whose order to extend the Florida East Coast Railway was then given. However, in 1898, Julia Tuttle would fall ill with apparent meningitis. And I understand how rough that is because I too had meningitis. I had it in 2013 after making out with this girl at a frat party. In any case, Julia would be known as the mother of Miami, and the only woman to have founded what would become a major American city. But little did she know her life's work would be muddied by a bunch of idiots. So now for this next part, let me place you in Times Square. You're in Times Square, New York. You're eating a hot dog or whatever they would eat in the 1920s. I don't know, like boiled fish. It's the wintertime. You got on one of those weird beaver hat things. You're cold. Anyway, you see a huge billboard above you in big lights. It features scantily clad women on a beach sunbathing, a bright yellow sun, white sands, blue oceans. And in the middle of the billboard it says, "It's June in Miami." Developer Carl Fisher put up this ad and many more around the country to advertise the plots of land that were now for sale in South Florida. After years of attempts, the Everglades, the swampy wetlands in central and southern Florida, had now been successfully drained, and much land was reclaimed in South Florida and other parts of the state, leading to a real estate boom. Developers would bring reporters down from all parts of the US to show the progress on the land reclamation. Those reporters would report back to their papers and build the buzz about Florida even more. Cities like Hialeah, just northwest of Miami, seemingly popped up overnight from the swamp. And this land reclamation and excitement for the potential of Florida brought down not only land developers, but also charlatans. Further upstate in Jacksonville, a familiar man named Charles Ponzi saw an opportunity. Fresh out of jail on bond from his schemes in Massachusetts, Charles started a real estate company in Jacksonville called Charpon Land Syndicate, where he sold plots of swampland east of Jacksonville. He was capitalizing on the Florida craze buzzing throughout the nation. Many investors and Americans that just wanted a vacation home would buy from developers thinking that the land would be ready to go like they had heard, only to find that they had bought land in swamps. And even if the developer that you had bought land from wasn't a generationally fraudulent charlatan, or the land was actually dry and usable, the issue was that those early advertisements in Times Square were dishonest, particularly about the weather in Florida. The promise of blue waters, white sand beaches, and a beaming, happy yellow sun wasn't the full story. What those early advertisements failed to depict was a pissed off, angry storm, an angry hurricane that was about to hit. In 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane would hit the state and cause $100 million of damage. This was the costliest hurricane in U.S. history when adjusted for wealth normalization. The storm would destroy any excitement there was for Florida vacation properties or investment. So after the abysmal failure of the Florida land boom, how was the city gonna come back to life? Who would permanently settle the newly dredged areas? Well, first, I want you to take a look at a picture of this man. What do you think of when you see him? Hacky music? Aviator shades enthusiast? Sure, those are things we all think of. But when you see him, do you think revolutionary? Do you think political refugee? Well, maybe you should. In interviews, below-average rapper Pitbull has discussed how his Cuban-American mother was a part of a clandestine operation called Operation Peter Pan. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, many parents feared that Fidel Castro would terminate parental rights and place minors in communist indoctrination centers. So with the help of the Catholic Church and the Eisenhower administration, 14,000 unaccompanied minors arrived in the United States. And that wasn't the only wave of Cubans to Miami in the 60s. In the first 15 years after the revolution, 500,000 Cubans arrived there. A few were the former President Batista's henchmen fleeing retribution from the Castro administration, but the vast majority were business and professional people whose property was threatened with seizure or who simply did not want to live under communism. Because of generous federal assimilation aid and to their own entrepreneurial drive, Cubans turned Miami from a sleepy tourist resort into a dynamic business hub. So the next time you hear "we at the hotel, motel, Holiday Inn," just know that when Pitbull raps those bars, he says it with the ancestors behind him. He runs to the hotel with an appreciation for capitalism and with the dreams and hopes of his forefathers, running in lockstep with him. And Pitbull isn't the only famous Cuban American. Other notable Cubans include Eva Mendes, Camila Cabello, this guy that looks like a diabetic rooster, and this guy that can't seem to keep his hands out the cookie jar. There are many Cuban Americans that have contributed to our society in a major way after their mass migrations in the 60s. But there's also a couple of notable Cuban Americans that wouldn't just be famous, they would be infamous. They would change what it meant to be from Miami and the image of the city altogether. In the early 1980s, Miami was a violent, super crazy place. The South Florida city had the highest murder rate in the nation. Salvador Magluta and Augusto Falcon were two first-generation Cuban immigrants and high school dropouts that had no idea they would go on to sell over 75 tons of cocaine. As some of Miami's most notorious drug traffickers, they would make an estimated $2.1 billion in cocaine money together. But at the height of their power, these drug lords weren't seen as awful people. In fact, Magluta and Falcon were viewed as Robin Hood figures in their community. The two Cuban Americans were locally known as Los Muchachos or the Boys. They often gave their money to local schools and charities. But these two were also a huge part of the Miami drug war in the 70s and 80s. This is a drug war that pitted the under-resourced Miami Police Department with Colombian cartels and these Cuban American traffickers with seemingly infinite resources. Several Miami police officers have described this era as a time of chaos. Not only did drug traffickers have more powerful weapons than the cops, but authorities didn't have access to modern-day technology that could help them track criminals down. For example, one of the biggest smugglers was Griselda Blanco. She was indicted in 1975 by federal forces, but evaded capture from the authorities for 10 years and wasn't arrested until 1985. The struggle by law enforcement to put an end to the influx of cocaine into Miami led to the creation of CENTAC 26, a joint operation between the Miami-Dade Police Department and the DEA. While many of the big-time traffickers would fall in the 80s, Sal and Willie, or Los Muchachos, would evade capture for a number of years after that, due to their control of the Miami political, judicial, and correctional systems. It would take even more scrutiny and resources on behalf of the federal government to bring them to justice and dissipate some of the corruption in Miami's local government. And so in the years after the Miami drug war ended and the biggest criminals were put away for life, I could tell you about how the economy in Miami has prospered, how the city of Miami was able to take some of the power back from the fraudsters, from the kingpins, and how the legal economy has grown. For example, how the cruise industry has grown, how Carnival Cruises is the 5th largest private employer in the city at 3,500 employees, and Royal Caribbean International is the 8th largest at 2,989 employees. But nobody wants to hear that. The people want to hear about scams! They want to do Medicare scams, mortgage scams, identity theft. It's even become dangerous to be a mailman because mail is apparently a great way to steal identities. The financialization of our society and the growth of the bureaucratic state have changed the game for fraudsters in Miami. The same guy that would have sold you swampland in 1920 now has his Excel spreadsheet open, figuring out how he's gonna take your investment and use it to make other earlier investors' investments seem profitable. I'm trying to tell you that the fraudsters are now on Excel. So, man, who really knows why there's so many scammers in Miami? But if I had to say, I would say that it's a mixture of two different forces. There's one side where people are continually getting themselves into get-rich-quick schemes. You know, there's always a hot new thing and a new industry that's popping up. And while the few people that succeed in it are broadcast to the world as geniuses and heroes, no one talks about the thousands that don't make it and lose their life savings chasing a dream. And there's also another side where the illegal world has continuously undermined the legal world, where young men don't respect the legal world, where the illegal world was arguably maybe more powerful than the legal world up until the 90s. And everyone wants to be a part of the underworld because for some, the legal world isn't helping them to accomplish their dreams fast enough. In many ways, these drug dealers are idolized, and to a certain extent, it's also understandable that these young people don't want to participate in mainstream society. Because at the same time, this is a city that was ranked the third most unequal city in the US, behind Atlanta at number 2 and San Juan, Puerto Rico at number 1. And this survey was done by the census, so there's got to be something to it. But I don't know, man, there's just really so much to this story. The history of crime and drugs in the city of Miami is really long. You know, I didn't get to mention how the Miami Herald once said that the period of prohibition in the 1920s was the most protracted and pervasive period of lawlessness and debauchery in the city's history. And who knows how that contributed to the legacy of lawlessness in the city. So if you want to see a video about that stuff, let me know. But if nothing else, I'm gonna go eat a pulled pork sandwich. Urgh!